Welcome to the AGvisorPOD.
Well, hi, everybody. This is Rob Saik here, and welcome to another edition of the AGvisorPOD. Today, we're going to tackle biologicals, and we've got three great guests for you. Brian Hora is a regenerative farmer. He's been working with biologicals for a long time, and he's just got a load of experience. Him and his son Mitchell run Continue and Mag. Greg Shepard is a field agronomist. He's also involved in cattle and livestock integration. He's got a big background in the integration of biologicals. And then Christie Apple, what a wonderful person, so much experience in ag retail, working in all kinds of crops, especially crops, as she comes to us from Wisconsin. So we are in for one heck of a webinar podcast with these three great guests studying biologicals and their impact on agriculture. Let's get going. Well, biologicals have been around since the 50s with seaweed extract. And of course, most of you know about inoculants that we've been using in pulse crops for a long time. What really opened my eyes was a recent trip I had to Spain, where I visited a company called Kimitec that was doing extracts from plants and then basically using DNA sequencing to find out the activity, whether it was herbicidal, fungicidal, insecticidal activity of plant molecules on plants to help us. And I also ran across some testing that was being done by a company called Crop and biomarkers and all of that sort of stuff. And so that began really opening my eyes. And then you think about the recent news of like Kimitec licensing some of their technology to the likes of some of the big boys in the marketplace. And you know that this is going to happen at an increased rate. European Union and Brazil is probably leading the way with about 25 to 55% of farmers in those two areas playing with biologicals. Canada and the United States are about tied, and somewhere under 25, 23% of farmers playing with biologicals. So why are we looking at this topic? Well, I'm going to start off with Christie. She's going to open it up on why the biological area is increasing in terms of awareness in the agricultural sector. So Christie, I'll turn it over to you, and then Greg, and then we'll round it out with why with Brian. So Christie, take it away.
Thanks for the intro, Rob. Yeah, I think there's some interesting things that have really initiated more widespread interest in implementing biological practices on farm, whether it be a drive or a desire to chase soil health, whether it be a drive or desire to, somehow shift the money that you're currently spending on your inputs, but also recognizing that the world is run by corn and soybeans. Mm-hmm. The world agricultural market is really driven by what's going on in that market space, and so much global trade and other things are associated with that. But we've really kind of hit a plateau in terms of big events in corn and soybeans. Big events like genetically modifying corn or soybeans to withstand herbicide, or inserting traits to resist bugs and pests, which made tremendous jumps in yield and crop quality and predictability of our crop performance. I feel like there's not a lot of big events left for corn and soybeans. And so I personally believe, in my understanding of working in the arena of biostimulants and biologicals for many, many years now, that my agronomy experience and training came through the lens of soil health. And so much of what we were doing was always understanding the impact of our soil based on every single pass that we make. We're either helping or harming our soil quality and our water quality. And so I feel like we've reached a point in, our largest crops that drive, the global engine of ag inputs and ag innovation. And where we're at today is now sort of looking at these other areas where we can make impact. And I feel like the biological umbrella covers many, many different things. And I'm excited to be able to get into that and disseminate some of that with you guys today. But I feel like what's driving the interest now is this is what's next. Our seed treatments are getting better and better. Our other tools, are coming to the table now to start turning the small dials, because a lot of the big ones have already been tuned in.
Well, you're right. And when we think about biologicals, there's three big areas: biocontrols, we have biostimulants, and we have biofertilizers. Those are the three big areas. Greg, from your perspective, why are we looking at this topic? I think consumers are also driving as part of it, but why are we looking at biologicals? What is it that intrigues you about them, Greg?
Yeah, I think Christie hit the nail on the head. I think there's a new frontier in potential biological discovery, and I do. Yeah, consumers are driving it. More and more people are interested in understanding how their food was grown, where it comes from, and just environmental concern and care, which farmers, they absolutely need. They're environmentalists as well. They work in the soil, just as you mentioned, livestock. They're the caretakers of creation here. But in terms of the potential for the biological frontier, like I said, has just incredible potential for growth. I think a lot of scientific discovery for agriculture has taken place in broad stroke discoveries of chemical active ingredients. For example, we have increased fertilizer application technology and even fertilizer technologies, which Rob, I know you're an expert on that. But biology is a little more, a little tricky, a little more transient, and most importantly, you have to get a little bit more specific, I think, as you with biostimulants in particular, and a whole another avenue, like you said, with biocontrols. Who knows how that could impact? That we can have biologically based chemicals, insecticides.
For sure. And this is the exciting part that I saw. In fact, I was just listening to somebody the other day talking about the utilization of snake venom and scorpion venom to isolate and create biological broad-based insecticides. But there is specificity when it comes down to the success farmers have or don't have with biologicals. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. And Brian, you've been experimenting with these things for a long time. So the first question I have as an agronomist, and the second one, maybe bigger one, is as a farmer, why the heck are you playing with this stuff when we know so much about, NPK, S, zinc, boron, iron? Why are you looking at this, Brian?
Well, it's kind of a two-pronged approach, and as Christie mentioned earlier, and Greg hit on as well, that quality and quantity is what we've been trying to build over years. But what we're realizing is the quality of the product. We're looking at very limited scope in the past. We've been trying to just basically eliminate insect pressure and the damages that insects and diseases can do, but we really never looked at adding real nutrient value and biological healthy value to the products that we produce. And I really think that that's where a lot of this is going. You just into the just the social setting that we're dealing with, you hear so much more about probiotics into people and everything. Well, all this stuff, we don't have to keep adding fake stuff, okay? To put the best way. Why don't we just grow it the real way, the way it was really intended to be? And that's really where I'm coming from with this. As we have been doing this for a while and using on the farm, we use the Haiti soil health test. And this is probably our best method for broad scale, economically monitoring changes in the soil. And one of the key aspects of that test that we have never done before until we started utilizing this is the carbon respiration test, where we're actually measuring the amount of CO2 that is in the soil that is being essentially released by microbes in the soil. The more microbes you have, the more CO2 is not only consumed, but also carbon consumed, but also emissions secreted in the soil. Now, not all that makes it back to the atmosphere. Some of it stays there, but more activity means there's more biological activity, which means there's more cycling of nutrients and decomposition, and our soil becomes very much alive again. So in this process over the years, we've seen that level increase, and now we're trying to understand it better.
So I'm holding a report right now from a company called B Crop, and I'm looking at it. There are 673 different species they've measured into this thing, and they're looking at fungi, bacterial ratios. Brian, I'm going to turn this back through you and then back moving on to the next question. What are biologicals? and we talked about successes on your farm, but what are biologicals to you? What do they mean to you? I mean, we talked about biologicals for a long time have been inoculants, but what do they mean to you today? What do biologicals mean to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because as we've delved into this, I know that my soil is much more biologically active, more so than anything that's been.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
Simply by measuring the carbon dioxide.
Okay.
And so that's the one true verification of it. However, I can see it out there in the field as well. My degradation of residue, it happens fast. So I have to figure out ways to grow more residue or more plant material to have more residue on the surface. Otherwise, I have to bear black soil, because the biology is so active that they eat everything in a short period of time.
Well, that turns into organic matter, right?
It turns into organic matter. But all of that organic matter is feed for the biology in the soil. And the problem is, if I don't have enough feed for them, they're going to die off, and they won't reproduce as fast as they can. So I have to keep producing more and more and more all the time to keep that active system going. And the active system infiltrates water better. It filters water better. It provides more nutrients to the crop. It provides me stability in the crops that I raise.
So basically what you're talking here is, not only are you increasing the biological activity, but soil structure-wise, water infiltration, water holding capacity, the whole thing around sequestration, all of that is increasing on your farm.
It's all increasing. It is all leading to less weed pressure, less disease pressure, and more stable yields. So, and then in turn, a higher quality product that I'm producing.
I had a friend of mine, Dr. Ian Evans, a pathologist, once explained to me that dis-ease means crops that are out of ease. If you can make crops ease, in other words, they're in ease, then they can fight dis-ease. And so that's kind of it. Greg, what does biologicals mean to you?
That's a good question, because I think the reflex is biological products. No matter how they're applied, seed coat, in-furrow, foliar applied. But there's a whole, I really like the point Brian brought up about a system, because, I think sometimes, the natural tendency is that because of chemical active ingredients, for example, because of just products that have been generated, the natural inclination is to purchase something that I can use or apply to my crop that will solve my problems, and in a biological component. When in reality, I really like how Brian described the whole system and monitoring the health of that system, which of course this all takes us back and down into the soil. I mean, ultimately there's microclimates above ground, but mostly what we're paying attention to is soil health metrics and measurements of biological activity, in which I want to emphasize that really is the finish line. That's the goal that we're working towards, not necessarily, oh, here's this biological product that I can apply that will make me a regenerative farmer, or, make my farm sustainable, because it's a whole concept. And just like I stated before, biologicals and biological systems are much more complicated than just simple, I shouldn't say simple, but than chemical and physical properties.
A beautiful lob ball to Christie, because when we were teeing up this webinar, Christie, you were talking about biologicals are not a silver bullet. And we will talk about products here. We'll talk about satisfaction, but you use the terminology, biologicals are not a silver bullet. Let's tee you up and see what you have to say about Greg's comments and Brian's.
I mean, if we can wrap our head around the systems approach, I mean, this wasn't how Brian started farming. It was a process, and it's been a process. And this isn't where Greg started his career in coaching farmers how to do this, right? It has to be, we have to be careful not to make a soil health number or measure a destination for ourselves. It's not a merit badge. Because it's a living dynamic system, biological products are going to have all of these different niches that they suit best. What I'd like to say is, when we think about biologicals, they are as ag products. That's the topic of this discussion, right? If we're going to be purists in this, right, what we have to do is accept the fact that we know more about, the heavenlies than we do about the microbes in the soil. And there's companies like, biomakers that are making incredible strides at taking all these data points and putting them into reports and helping us to process them. But still, they'll email that to a farmer and farmers kind of get, starry-eyed, like, what do I do?
I'm staring at one right now.
Yeah,
So what?
There's so many data points there for us to do it. So there is not one single product that's going to come and fix your whole farm. Unfortunately, we've been farming for multiple generations thinking that urea, potash, or anhydrous are the tools to solve our yield problems. What we have to do is get our brain space out of the yield number goal and out of the soil health, assessment number goal and into a place of a systems approach. If I make a decision to add a seaweed extract or add an amino acid or add a biopesticide into my system, that's going to affect every other decision that I make on my farm. There will be an impact. You cannot make a pass across a field without it negatively or positively affecting these things. And so we have to start paying more attention to that. That level of integrating those new tools into the system, sometimes they're displacing old tools. And so we get this like warm, fuzzy feeling that, oh man, I used that product and it gave me a 3 bushel yield. In fact, that is how these products are being marketed to farmers. And I think that that's grossly unfair. I may be farming 250 bushel corn year in and year out, and I'm doing just fine, but maybe introducing a biological will displace something else on my farm that makes my 175 bushel yield actually more profitable on a margin per acre basis. What my input costs look like.
We're going to come to that profitability thing that Brian and I were talking about too. And I want to quote something here for a second for our listeners. Stratus Ag Research just interviewed 1,029 farms in the United States and 1,234 farms in Canada, and 23% of those farms. So you're talking about, call it 1,100 farms in Canada, the United States each interviewed. About 23% of them have been playing with biologicals. The most common crops, of course, that are being worked on with biologicals in the United States, is corn and soybeans, winter wheat, spring wheat. In Canada, the leader actually is wheat, followed by canola, soybean, and corn. Some of the common tools that we've kind of grown up with, if you're my age, rhizobium or nitrogen-fixing biologicals, and then one of the top ones being used in both countries out of Novozyme is penicillium, which is a phosphate solubilizing, biological. But there's lots more coming. So the next question is, what kind of biologicals? And we're going to get into, and I looked here at the survey in the United States. The top biologicals that people were playing with included Pivot Bio, Novozyme's Loveland, looks to me like Exotic, Sound Agriculture, Corteva. In Canada, Novozyme, Exotic, Corteva, ATP, Black Earth, and Taurus were companies providing biologicals. Greg, what kind of biologicals have you played with? How did you make the decision to start? What are you seeing? Over to you, Greg, then Brian.
Sure. The simple question is, there's obviously an economic consideration there, but I think what would fit into what I have tried on our own operation and what I think I see a lot of other farmers, the low-hanging fruit, if you will, for trying biological products are those that have an impact and they're easy to apply. So that's why seed treatments, especially soybean inoculants, is where, some farmers have used soybean inoculants and barely even know it, if they're not very in tune with what's going on in the seed, for example. But I've also tried Sound Agriculture and the Proven 40, actually, from Pivot Bio as well. And that provides some context for some of my comments, because, biologicals are a different animal than many other products we use in agriculture. And we have to get down on just back to what Christie and Brian have talked about. We have to get down to even understanding field by field. Do they have different histories? This is really a journey, and using these products is a journey. But, even my tendency is to want to use a product and expect it to just perform right down the line. Consistency. It is a product and consistently provide returns, but that's not necessarily, we really have to understand, what might be limiting factors in what biological product we need to use. And I see these companies that are producing biological products, they're trying to, just as Christie mentioned, they're trying to replace anhydrous or 32%, for example, and trying to market it that way. And I think there's going to be a little bit of a roller coaster in performance. I mean, I have no doubt they'll improve, but and maybe roller coaster is a little extreme, but not as consistent as, say, a herbicide, an insecticide, treated on the seed, applied on the crop. Those are just pretty well black and white, and they perform very consistently across many different environments, many different crops even. This is getting down and understanding what's going on in our soil, as Brian mentioned with the Haney test, and really understanding just nutritional levels, and not only what's, because just as we know, NP and K, even if it's in the soil, doesn't necessarily mean it's available to a crop. Those nutrients, I love to kick off a conversation with farmers and say, do you realize that nutrition has to go through some biological aspect of soil, that microbial degradation or availability to make that available to the crop? Even when you apply P and K.
Well, as a longtime agronomist, I start with the discussion with farmers around soil organic matter, pH, and then we get into cation exchange capacity, and then we look at nutrient balance, and we have to fix those. We have to make sure that there's zinc in the soil. Biologicals don't magically make zinc, and maybe they do or don't. I don't know, Brian. This is going over to you, but if you take two soils, Brian, you take a tired, worn out soil and a soil like yours is biologically quote unquote active, there's going to be different responses in terms of the products that you have tested. Your comments on how does a farmer make, people, PowerPoints all look very similar, and the sales guys are great, lots of information, but how does a farmer kind of make a decision? What's your experience?
Yeah, and I've had a lot of different products come at me. So trying to figure out which one is the right fit is a challenge. And really, you need to find a resource of the supplier needs to provide you some really good input as to best case scenario. Because even on our farm where it's overall very biologically active, there are areas that are not as active as others. And some of these products might work really, really good in a certain soil type and under certain conditions. And in other places, they don't work at all. There's basically zero response. So trying to dive deeper into the perfect fit for those products is kind of a key. However, the problem is that most of these products have not been tested on the variety of situations that we all have. We'll have different soil types. Okay, that's the easy given. But the problem is all of our soil types, they act differently. As Christie was alluding to earlier, they act differently based on the activities that we perform out there, the products we perform, the weather, the crop rotation, all those things. They all affect the ability of the biological system to happen. And you got to find the right biological product to match your biological system.
I think this is where wisdom.
A dead dry system, a lot of these products will work. On a very active system, it's going to be harder to make that decision and harder to find the right fit.
I think this is right back to Christie's wheelhouse in terms of how do we get started? I know people listening to this are saying, well, I'm still waiting for the magic answer. I tuned in on this webinar, this podcast to learn about how to start integrating biologicals on my farm. And I'm still not hearing how to do it. Christie, where's the starting point? How does a farmer think about, an agronomist start thinking about the integration of a biological strategy into their operation?
I think the best place to start is to do a little self-farm reflection and kind of prioritize where you see your biggest vulnerabilities are on your farm. Before you give in to marketing strategies, before you give in to companies tying a seed discount to you trying these products, pump the brakes and take it slow, take it piece by piece. You may be investing in a biological that's fixing a problem that you don't currently have. And so you may be saying, I want a biological that makes more N, that's going to save me money, right? Or it's going to make me more corn or whatever crop you're growing. That might be an outcome, but likely will not be an outcome for you because nitrogen isn't your biggest limiting factor. You may be dealing with something else in your soil. So as far as where to begin on that journey is really understanding, where do I feel I'm most vulnerable? Is it a cultural practice thing that I can fix my practices with and not need a product to fix? In many cases, that is where it needs to begin, is what I'm currently doing supportive of a biologically dynamic environment, right? So that's how you have to start on that journey. It isn't subscribing to, a religious belief system of how to farm, till or not till, regen or not, organic or not. We've done too much of that over the last 15 years and given people a bad taste in their mouth about innovative practices. And so instead, I would challenge or have you take a look at what are my current practices? Where do I currently feel the most vulnerable? And that includes looking at your bottom line. And I don't mean to overemphasize that, but Brian can attest on their farm. They've dramatically shifted where they're spending money on their farm. They might not be saving bottom line dollars necessarily, but they're putting resources in different places to have better, more profitable outcome and more yield quality with nutrient density.
Let's go to Brian then. Let's talk about some bottom line figures then, Brian. Like we talked earlier when I was on the phone with you about the impact, the economic impact, because we have, to Christie's point, you have ideological. I'm going to go to regenerative in a second, but you got ideology that people talk about, but ideology necessarily isn't connected to pragmatism. And so, Brian, you've been pragmatically looking at your bottom line. Can you talk a little bit about how your mind has shifted over the last 10, 12 years?
Yeah. As I mentioned, we're doing all this testing, and as my mindset shifts on this, the thing that I'm really looking at doing is verifying what I'm doing, not just by what I see, but get some numbers behind it to prove the processes. So earlier, Bob, you mentioned the biomakers test, and I've mentioned the Haney test. A third test that we are running, and we will be running those tests on every zone, on every farm this year. Which we've been running the Haney test every year, so I got multiple years of that. But the biomakers test, really understanding what the biology is that's out there and get a baseline set. But the third piece that we're adding to it is the total nutrient digest test, telling me what is actually out there. If I were to break down everything on that soil and knowing that most of it's not available, but what is actually there can I make available? That's where we're kind of going with this and trying to better utilize the actual nutrients that are there in the soil. And for our case, I know that I can go down at least 3 to 4 feet and bring nutrients up because my worms can do that. And they're doing it because I see the soil that they're bringing up from 3 to 4 feet deep because it's a different color than what's on the surface. But this orange color is showing up on the surface now from worm activity. So they're bringing the nutrients up that my plants want and the other microbes want. So in that process, in all the testing that we've done, we've watched our nutrient levels on the farm increase, and they're increasing faster than the nutrient levels are increasing in a rate that I don't really even have to put some of this stuff on anymore. And we're putting less and less and less on, and in some cases eliminating some of the P&K applications.
Well, this is really interesting because now you're talking about nutrition, basically chemistry of the soil. And we know that if farmers consistently are no-till, for example, and just consistently testing 0 to 6 inches, that you're going to suffer from something called nutrient stratification. And you're going to think, but what you're doing actually by increasing the soil tilth, and you say about the worm activity, is you're bringing those nutrients up from the bottom closer to the top. And you're actually seeing that in the different colors of soil, right, Brian?
Yeah, that's true. And I've seen, and there's a lot of different information out there. I've seen data, some research that indicates that in a really active soil, that you can turn over the top 6 inches of soil, completely turn it over in a 15-year period.
Yep, start the process over again.
The worms are bringing everything up and replace the top 6 inches. which is amazing. So stratification, I don't worry about stratification because I have nutrients moving everywhere and I got roots everywhere. So that's not an issue for us. But trying to make more of that available, and some information I've seen says that only 0.4% of the phosphorus per acre that's out there is available to the crop. And that's what we're going to try to figure out with this total nutrient digest is, do I have 10 or 15,000 pounds of phosphorus available in the top foot of my soil? The total phosphorus, not available, total phosphorus. It's somewhere in that range, I believe. It might be higher. So if I can make more of that, if I can get to 1 or 2% available, I've got all the phosphorus I need.
Well, this is a beautiful lead-in because phosphorus, when you put it in the soil, can get locked up into something like 23 or 26 insoluble states. One of the biggest biologicals that's been used in both countries, Canada, the U.S., is Jumpstart, which is a penicillium that solubilizes phosphorus. And it's one of the products that we've used with pretty high degree of success because, again, if you kind of look at the soil and you say, okay, there's a lot of things, aluminum locking up phosphorus, then this can help, or calcium carbonate locking up phosphorus, this can help. Phosphorus can also come from the integration of livestock. And when you hear people talk and expound about regenerative agriculture, they talk about the integration of livestock. Greg, you're integrating livestock into the operation. How do you think about that integration? Not for everybody. Not everybody's going to become a cattle farmer. But how do you think about it? And bouncing off of Brian and phosphate, how do you think about livestock?
Well, I think we have to remember there's, livestock above ground and really the microbes, livestock below ground. And I thought Brian described that very well, but I want everybody on the call to remember that Brian's soils are probably exceptional as compared to the majority of certainly the majority of the farms that I traverse. So there are ways to accelerate that, right? But you're thinking about adding biological components to the system again, right? And one of the ways is biological animals above ground. So integrating animals, especially grazing animals, of course, can really, that's just a whole different opportunity to add manure, cycle nutrients. It's very easy on our farm, we're beginning to integrate cover crop grazing, and just seeing a lot of benefits there because there's a lot that can be done over a few years, 3-5 years with no-till and cover crops, and certainly boosting microbial populations and, just as Brian said, respiration of soil. But when you add manures and animals, I mean, there's even studies that have been done on the saliva of cattle, for example, interacting with soil microbes and stimulating plant growth. And this is a whole area of, I guess I'll say, relatively free biological additives that we can integrate into our system without it necessarily being a product that we go and buy. So you have to remember, it's also about, I want to just get back to something that I know we'll all agree on, but it's thinking about the house that you're building and maintaining for those soil microbes. It's thinking about food, shelter, water, and that's what any biological organism needs to survive and thrive. So,
back in the day, I ran a contest with a company called AgriTrend that I'd founded called the Canola 100 contest. It was 100 bushel of canola target yield in a 3-year contest, and the winner was 88.6 bushels per acre over 50 acres of dryland canola. Background to that field had been cattle manure. People have asked me about how do you value manure? If you're going to sell manure to a neighbor, how do you value it? I said, well, take your nutrients that you have in the sample and at least double the value of that nutrient, because there's something inside of manure, and now you're telling me inside of cow spit, I never heard that before, that leads to microbial activity in the soil and helps to activate soil. Now, not everybody has livestock, but you made a good point. There's livestock above the soil and livestock below the soil. Christie, what have you learned about the livestock below the soil in the last 10 years that you never knew before? Because we're all learning, unlearning, and relearning. What have you learned that you didn't know?
A couple of things that have been, kind of aha moments for me over my agronomy journey regarding soil microbial activity is that absolutely nothing that happens in the soil environment happens without the biology basically dictating and or regulating those functions. They are quite literally the mesh with which everything passes, whether it be water movement, soil solution movement. They influence absolutely everything. Another aha moment that kind of, has been more recent, especially as I've dove heavy into the fruit and vegetable side of things, helping permanent crop farmers who are not tilling because they're orchards and vineyards and permanent crops, that the soil disturbance has such, as in my opinion, we have dramatically underestimated how damaging soil disturbance on a large scale is to our ag system. We're essentially wiping out the mycorrhizae and all kinds of other subcategories of fungi every single time we till. Now, that isn't to just vilify tillage and put that on a chopping block per se, but what I am saying is that our cultural practices, we have dramatically underestimated how our cultural tillage practices, and in some cases, recreational tillage practices, have been our limiting factor, not our NP&K, not our herbicide, not our disease control, but actually our tillage practices. So I think that those were two really pivotal education moments in terms of soil microbiology or soil biology and function that really shaped the way that I look at this whole, even in the ag products sector. There's so many farmers out there that because of their soil textures, because of where they geographically farm, relation to watersheds, et cetera. I grew up in a very important watershed here in Michigan in the Saginaw Bay Basin. Everything that we did, every practice we make and all the soil that moves and blows away or doesn't blow away, is affecting our water quality. So I think that, I would say that those are the three biggest aha moments that, have really been impactful for me. That soil tillage practices, how our agricultural or our soil practices affect our water quality as well as our soil quality, and how the soil microbes are quite literally the mesh, the absolute finest mesh of all.
So the comments you make are really important for people to understand, is that, that moving through the soil with mechanics destroys soil structure, destroys water infiltration, upsets the microbial balance. Now, to Brian's earlier point, if you're practicing no-till for 10 or 15 years, can you turn the soil over and start the process over again? I believe that you can. I have shares in a farming operation in Uganda, and I have witnessed in Kenya, where you have these subtropical soils, and they're coming through with one-way diskers and tilling the shit out of the soil, doing the worst thing possible to a soil, which is fractioning the soil. It destroys soil structure, creates compaction. Yeah, so you made some really good points there. Now that's not to vilify tillage, and there's strip till and vertical tillage required in some jurisdictions. But as you travel the country, if you're honest, as you travel the country, I just was in Montana recently, and I saw too much tillage in that dry area there. So we got to change some of our mindset anyway. I want to go back to the Stratus Ag research study that was done on biostimulants. You guys can Google that. In the United States, it says that about 55%, and in Canada 48%, of the farmers were very or somewhat satisfied with biostimulants, biologicals. Dissatisfied 12%, 10%. Interesting, the split between the two jurisdictions. In the United States, the farmers that were most happy with biologicals were under the age of 40, and in Canada, the ones most satisfied with biologicals were over the age of 40. I don't know what that means. Committed to more use of biologicals. 31% of farmers are committed to more biologicals. Brian, Why do you think farmers are paying attention now to biologicals? What is it? Is it the push from the companies? Is there an alternate reason that farmers are starting to go, I'm going to have a look at this?
I want to hit on that. Can I go back to one thing that Christie mentioned a minute ago?
Yep.
And I'll jump right back on this. I don't want to belabor it. But one of the things that I've mentioned early, we've been pulling these soil tests weekly and watching trends of nutrient availability. One of the most interesting things that I have seen, though, is to go to a soil lab that's doing a respiration test and get the data and look at the biological activity throughout the year. These labs, they track, what the numbers are throughout the season as they get samples in. But one of the most interesting things that I've seen, and we see the practice on our farm and are trying to eliminate, is in the early spring that you stop and think about biological activity when everything has, when the temperature, the environment, the moisture, and the food supply are all really good. What do biological things do? They reproduce. Okay. And that's what we see in the spring of the year as biological activity in the soil increases in the month of April and May. But on the aggregated data from the lab, there's a dip. Then the respiration number drops at the end of May, 1st of June. It drops significantly, and then it picks back up. And as we talk about the food source being available, but Christie mentioned tillage, but I think another part of what's driving activity in biology is temperature. And the tillage and exposure of the ground to temperature shuts down some of this activity. And
Brian, just to interrupt you for a second, because I want to know the answer to this. How do we test the soil? I know the test. You've mentioned the biome makers. You've mentioned Haney. We could talk about Sovita, et cetera. But more practically, do you do a composite? Do you do a benchmark area sample? Do you do grid sampling? Do you do zone sampling? How do you practically approach where you take the soil test from?
We are on these weekly tests because this test is running us on average about $100 every time we send one in. Okay. Mm-hmm. So by the time we collect it, mail it, and all the stuff. So we're doing about 15 locations on the farm right now. Are
they GPSed here? Are they consistent?
Yes, they are the exact same spots every time. They're within probably a 20-foot circle in the field. So the stamper goes to the same spot every time. We're doing things inside and outside of cover cropped areas, and especially where we're relay cropping, where we have our most intensive cover crops going on. And that's fascinating to see in the month of June, where you've got cover crops growing versus where there's no cover crops, you have twice as much biological activity, which means twice as much nutrients become available. And then on top of that, we've also done some testing and watching of temperatures of cover crop versus tilled fields versus no-till fields. And the soil temperatures, when you see a range of 50 degrees of surface temperature during the day, you know that it's having an impact. And when we see 90 degree soil temperatures 4 inches deep in a conventionally tilled field, there's no biology happening in 90 degrees. Who wants to do anything in living thing, anything when it's 90? Nobody does. So anyhow, we're pinpointing that information, but it's fascinating to see throughout the year what happens, what drives biology, and the environment is as important as anything.
Have you played with biological teas at all? I mean, I was talking to one of my buddies down in Montana, Frank Grinowig, who was playing with biological teas in a very dry environment down there, and primarily they're shooting towards more fungus activity. Have you played with those?
No, we haven't done anything with those at this point.
Christie, have you?
Yeah, I have personally. We don't use those on our farm. I have shied away from theirs because there's, it's just a myriad of a rabbit hole of how you want to do that. I have seen some really interesting results, and I think that there's a good case to be made there. But right now, it's so grassroots. We're not seeing a lot of universities or private contractors wanting to jump into the research on that side of things. But I think that there's some interesting learnings to be brought out of that, especially on, smaller scale. I think scalability is always going to be a limiter for being able to produce teas or being able to produce native teas. I've seen that, where we're producing things that come from our own farm, fermenting them or processing them in some way, shape, or form, and reapplying them to our particular farm. And I've seen good results with that, right? So there's anecdotal evidence that says this is a thing we should be looking at. But again, it comes back to what's scalable. If you take a look at that study that you've referenced a few times, some of the greatest adapters of these biological practices are very large farms that have the people resources, financial resources to do the work, and then also to monitor the data. The smaller the scale of the farm, it would appear the less likely they are to adapt practices like that. We don't really know specifically why that is, but my suspicion is that farmers feel like they have they have more risk involved at that level that they're just not ready to pallet yet. So I think it'll be a while before we see that stuff become very mainstream. But I am encouraged to see on smaller scale. It's very popular in vegetable production to utilize teas, and so some of the specialty crop foods that go directly to our table, I think it's going to be more adapted in that space than it will ever be adapted on like a broadacre corn soybean farm, scenario.
Moving back to you, Greg, on cover crops. I live in northern, there's snow all over the place, still cold here. I don't know when we're going to get in the field, could be another 45 days. But when you harvest the crop and you're battling snow and trying to get the crop off before October 15th or October 31st, pretty hard to seed a cover crop. However, where you get down in southern climates, you got this window that's larger. What's your experience with cover crop and how it influences the performance of the biology, the soil, and the biologicals that you might integrate into that system?
Yeah, so we have more of an opportunity to get cover crops up and growing and really get a lot of biomass generated above and below ground. And that just is a huge win for soil microbes in particular, the biology of the soil, because living roots just absolutely are a game changer. I heard Brian mention relay cropping. That is something that I applaud him for delving into it. I haven't first, I farm on the side, and that's a good example of just having biological active roots and root exudates and feeding those microbes. Also rooting channels, and then that's below ground. And then above ground, if you can get some biomass for, just as Brian mentioned earlier, to continually feed those microbes into the late fall, winter months, and right away early in the spring. Now, soil biology is, of course, driven by temperature, but if you don't have food and shelter, you're not going to increase those populations, and they're going to plateau very, very rapidly. So I do want to put a plug in for an area that I'm really paying close attention to, and something probably young farmers, the below 40 age range. It's just different methods of seeding cover crop, and oftentimes they're maybe drone or robotic. I think that we're going to really see a lot of expansion and growth and it's not only cover crops, but it's just what we're able to do in crop. That's why I think relay cropping is I think we may begin to see more of that as we're able to do more mechanically with technology and precision technology.
Sounds like a theme for another webinar that we're going to have to take on. Hey, the three of you, we haven't focused specifically on products, and this isn't a product plug type of discussion, but of the products that are out there, there are these nitrogen fixing products today, like Nutritia, Pivot, Invita, these kind of products. Then there's of course, the phosphate solubilizing products. There are stimulation products. There are control products. Without getting everybody charged up on a specific brand or product, which groups are of interest to you, Brian? What areas are, we have three things. We have biocontrols, biostimulants, biofertilizers. What areas are really of interest to you as a farmer?
Well, the ones that I'm kind of using and have kind of settled in on is early on the biostimulants and biofertilizers are something I like to use at planting time. Mm-hmm. I want to get those products in the ground at the planting time, right next to the seed, and I'm putting them right in the furrow. And a lot of those products, when you get them, and even some of the foliar applied, your Invidia, for example, but like your Pivot Bio, you were talking about the teas, the compost teas and such before. Basically, you're putting microbes into a solution that is feed for them. Okay. So once I get these things into the ground, I have to feed them. And my belief is, as I get these microbes and things stimulated in the ground and get them going, I just have to keep feeding them and feed them throughout the year. And living plants throughout the year feeds them, keeps them around, and keeps them going. So hopefully I won't need them as much in the future because I naturally have that system working for me. And so I love to put those stimulants in the furrow. And then the biocontrols are some things that I think become more important later in the season for disease control and such. And so those will go on foliar applied. In our situation with a lot of cover crops, I have to realize that most of what I'm going to spray over the top is never going to touch the ground. So if it has to have soil contact, my only option is to put it in furrow at this stage. So that's kind of something I do focus on.
The whole idea of healthy soils, healthy crops, you can't have healthy soils without healthy crops, to your point, Brian, and you also need healthy soils to have healthy crops. This is a virtuous cycle. Of the products that are out there, biocontrols, biostimulant, biofertilizers, Christie, which areas are kind of hot for you? What interests you?
Plant stress management, I think, is probably something that I spend a lot of time focusing on because it's an area that we can move a needle. And also goes back to what I brought up earlier, and farmers recognizing where they're most vulnerable or where their biggest risk factors are on their particular farm. A lot of times we have hidden stressors that are robbing our yields, that are robbing our quality, and cause these plants to accumulate unwanted compounds within them that sort of negatively impact the overall plant health. And although we may not be visually seeing an issue with the corn in the field, if we are preventatively and proactively supporting plant immune system function, early in the season in the furrow, stimulating rooting and shooting capacity of that plant and providing it with tools and resources to do that, I feel like the segment of this biological space, kind of focusing on the seaweed extracts and botanicals, provides us with really good consistency and in helping with plant health early on, particularly when our soils begin to warm up. As Brian mentioned, we start to see naturally a decrease in activity. And so if we have a root exudate that is high quality from a healthy plant, we can encourage and keep those systems going, symbiotically. So I spend a lot of time educating and encouraging farmers to look at that segment. I think that there's a lot of a consistent response that we can get out of that space. And eventually when you find that hit your stride with how to use those materials, you may start to become more comfortable with limiting some of your other practices over time. In terms of other things we're doing under the guise of plant health, like applying fungicides, for example, a lot of the bill of sale given to a farmer with a fungicide application is, yes, we're gonna take care of your tar spot or whatever your gosses, but we're also going to stimulate plant health. And so I kind of take this position of, can we stimulate plant health in advance of a strike and preventatively support that immune response or that defense response within that plant? I say yes. I've seen it happen. I have 14 years in my agronomic career that has makes a really strong case for that. I won't mention any specific products, although I've seen it work, and then I've also seen farms that have used a specific biostimulant year after year after year and find themselves saying, "Gosh, it isn't really doing anything for me anymore."
Well, this is one of the questions that came in my career. One of I think he'll go down as one of the godfathers in terms of stress management. Jerry Stoller passed away, but his company was just sold to Corteva for $1.2 billion. There's something there. Understanding how to influence cytokinin production early on and how to control ethylene and abscisic acid later on. But one of the questions coming in from Brett was a lot of biological products border or flat out pseudoscience with negative returns. How do you tell what's legitimate, what's snake oil? Brian, do you have any advice? I know that AgVisor Pro is going to play a big role because you can contact people like these on AgVisor Pro. Brian, what's your thoughts around pseudoscience versus legitimate? How do you weed that out?
That's a great question. It is really hard to go through. It comes down to trust of the product and the retailer or whoever that person is that's selling it to you. Look for things that have been proven. I mean, I'm in a position where I've seen things that I'll get opportunity to see things that are not necessarily proven yet. Okay, they have not gone through some of the rigors of what some testing systems would be. But just because it goes through a testing system and some group says, "Hey, this works," overall, it still doesn't mean it may not work on your farm because of other conditions. So try to get to that trust and find out what are you missing, and is it really going to solve your problem?
Back to what Christie said earlier on. A couple other comments came in the question: how will soil moisture affect these biologicals with 6 months of frozen soil? From Trent. And I think that the answer there is that, of course, it slows down the biological activity. And another one was in Western Canada, zero-till has saved our butts for 25 years, but the organic matter doesn't seem to be increasing. I think that's a rational observation. And I think that every 15 years or so, to Brian's point, you need to turn the soil and start the process over again, maybe a longer period of time up here in the cold than down in your way, but I think that could be done. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. This is a really complex but an exciting area. How do farmers get started? You got about a minute each. Christie, how do farmers get started on their biological journey to see what will work?
My number one recommendation is to establish a data baseline. Knowing where we begin will help us to understand if we've made progress, depending on what we choose to do over the years. So understanding where we are at today is essential. That's where Brian got started with this documentation process. Now it's gotten very elaborate. That, I'd like to blame Mitchell for that, but, Brian sees and has really been shown through the data what this actually can look like, but also how complicated it can be. Don't do it alone. You don't have to do this alone. There are good people, good agronomic advisors that can help you along your way. It's important to have a handful of people that you trust to bounce ideas off of, and get another farmer or two in your circle that have walked through some of these early stages of getting started to help guide you along the way. And whether that be to commiserate and just to understand where you're coming from, or to offer you some other suggestions and help you think outside of the box. I think learning from each other is essential. And I think understanding where you're starting is critical to even beginning the journey.
On AgVisor Pro, we're going to probably set up a biological community. You can join the regenerative ag community, but you don't have to take this walk alone. You can walk with good people like Greg. Greg, what's your advice for farmers to get started down this journey?
Yeah, there's a lot of variables in farming. And so there's a tendency to want to just control and reduce risk. And I get that. But I think you have to do your own testing. I think you have to be willing to reduce tillage, integrate cover crops, integrate livestock, and test some biological products. But I'm talking on, 40 acres. And that's extra work and extra management. My recommendation is to learn about your own fields, learn about your own farm. I think Brian's a good example of that. And become a little bit of your own scientist to really understand and build context, because we can make broad recommendations, but we're also just going to come back to the field level and really understanding your system and how you can begin to layer in small adjustments to increase biological activity and help your system become more robust and possibly more productive.
Brian, Mitchell is building a company, Continuum Ag, to help farmers down this journey. But you've been doing this on your own because it obviously is something that piqued your curiosity. What's your advice as we wrap up this discussion on biologicals?
So, should she bring his company into this? Yeah, because that's basically what I want to kind of finish up on. And to clarify, as I mentioned earlier about the turning of the soil, our worms turn our soil completely. I'm not doing any tillage. The system is doing it itself. I don't have to do that because the biological system does that on its own.
Good point.
However, as we look at little things and little changes, In our cropping systems and the way we raise crops year after year in a circular motion, we're always doing the same things over and over again. It looks the same year after year with little improvements, but in a real continuum, it looks the same, but you're changing little things that make it better. And that's what we do, is we change small things throughout the year to make the whole system better. And that's what that's is the definition of a continuum. And that's what we do. And find those little fine-tuned points that make us more consistent and just keep growing.
Well, that wraps it up. What a great discussion. We could go another hour easy on these areas, and I think that we will dive deeper into some of the specifics, biocontrols, biostimulants, biofertilizers in the future. Thanks for being with us, Christie and Greg and Brian. Well done. It was an awesome session with you folks, and thanks for being part of it. Well, that was another great AgVisor Pro pod. Thanks to our guests for coming on board, discussing this really in-depth topic of biologicals. If you want to contact any of them, you can do so by downloading the AgVisor Pro app on iOS or Android, and you can reach out to them there. And we will see you next time on the AgVisor Pod.